Compared to a lot of other competitive games, Splatoon is a pretty balanced game. I mean, there's definitely a massive gulf between the strongest and weakest weapons, but if you have a favourite weapon that you really like, you can push it to the highest levels of play in the right environments. While Splatoon's main weapon balance is pretty good, it has a problem with sub-weapon balance. The community has divided the sub-weapons into two categories: lethal bombs and utility subs. And when you look at the tier lists, there is a very clear divide between lethal bombs and utility subs, and it's not hard to see why. Bombs are incredibly strong. They're defined by their long fuse and their ability to deal over 100 damage. And just being able to deal 100 damage itself is an incredibly powerful effect. It applies the not alive debuff to a player, a debuff that when applied disallows you to make any actions for 7 seconds and then sends you back to your spawn, which also means you have to spend more time getting back to the fight. Combine this with their AoE, meaning they can apply this to multiple players in an area, as well as their long fuse, and what you have is an incredibly powerful area denial tool. Compare this to Toxic Mist, which is all about area denial, and sure, it lasts longer with a 5-second duration, but doesn't paint, doesn't damage, and it's easier to squid roll through. Compare bombs to utility subs, and it's just sad. But this conversation is flawed because it takes place in a vacuum, something that doesn't exist in Splatoon. Subs do not exist in the vacuum, they exist in a kit and are attached to main weapons and special weapons. A good sub isn't just the most powerful on paper, it is one that can cover a weapon's weaknesses, highlight its strengths. A sub could be really strong on a certain map or against a specific weapon. In an actual game of Splatoon, there is context, so let's add some. Let's take Inkbrush, for example, a really strong main weapon. It has a really unique gimmick with its roll that lets it roll through basically anything. This gives it a really aggressive playstyle with a lot of uptime, but it does have a weakness. Well, actually it has quite a few weaknesses. Its range. This weakness means that it can really struggle with matchups against some mid-range weapons. It can struggle to push out when locked in its spawn, and it can also struggle on some maps that don't give it much to do. And this is another place where lethal bombs have an edge. They can cover this weakness. Inkbrush can use its bomb to help its mid-range matchups. You can safely dislodge mid-range weapons by bombing them out. You can safely break lockouts, removing any players from important parts of the map, as well as charge your special from range. A lethal bomb like Splat Bomb seems like it would be the strongest sub for Inkbrush, but it isn't. In fact, I'd argue that having a Splat Bomb on Inkbrush defeats the purpose of playing Inkbrush in the first place. Inkbrush's short range weakness means that it likes to play in very forward positions, as in, Inkbrush lives in the enemy team's walls. Having a range weakness only really matters when you're not in range and cannot get in range. It can be an issue on maps like Bluefin and Museum, where by the nature of the map itself, your ability to move forward can be limited. But there are a lot more maps where you can, compared to where you can't. And on top of that, Splat Bomb is a thrown sub-weapon, and so it incentivizes sitting back so you can take advantage of its range, something Brush doesn't want to do. But worst of all is its ink cost. Inkbrush is a pretty ink efficient weapon, all things said, but the thing with Inkbrush is its uptime. On Brush, you're going to be rolling around the place for most of the game. You're going to be spending more time using ink than you are recovering it, so in practice, despite its efficiency, the ink economy is pretty tight. Splat Bomb then, taking up 70% of your ink tank, is horrendous for you, since you spend more time recovering ink and less time rolling around. At that point, why even bother playing Inkbrush if all you're going to do is sit back and spam bombs and recover ink? In practice, Splat Bomb has a lot of anti-synergy. Brush actually wants a sub that can take full advantage of its unique quirks, a lower cost sub or a sub that likes being used up close or in aggressive positions. Things like Torpedo, Ink Mine, Sprinkler. While Inkbrush may be a specific example, the point I'm trying to get at here is that sure, lethal bombs are strong on paper, they're very generalist and lack qualities to help them synergize with other weapons. On top of that, they're also not subscribed to my channel, which is very unsynergistic of them, and if the stats are to be believed, you're not too. So you should probably subscribe if you haven't already. And even if you think you have, just make sure to check for me, just in case, since every bit of support really does help. Oh, that hurts so much to say. What the utility subs lack in overall strength, they gain in specialization. They are more tailored towards a singular purpose. The obvious one is point sensor, since it only senses the points of players. But you also have subs like beacons, which pretty much only act as a super jump spot, and that's it. I mean, they also show any players on the map as a side utility, but it's only relevant to players that have time to open the map, and they're not the reason you're picking beacons here, let's be honest. You would be forgiven for thinking that such extreme specialization is impractical. I mean, how often do I really want a sub that can sense points when I can just damage things and paint stuff instead? And to be honest, that way of thinking can get you pretty far. However, as games get more and more optimized, more niche and specialized options start to get more valuable. As an example, I used to play a lot of card games back in the day, mostly Hearthstone when it was good, and Legends of Runeterra, which was always good. And in Legends of Runeterra, when building your deck, you were allowed to bring up to 3 copies of a card. And back in the early days where decks were not very optimized, you'd find that most decks just threw in 3 copies of all the strong cards that would work in their archetype. They'd add as much as they could of all the strong generalist cards. But as the meta developed and all the strong decks were getting more optimized, players would find themselves wanting to throw away 1 or 2 copies of a card to make room for more niche and specialized cards. Cards that aren't too powerful on their own but have really strong synergies with other cards in your deck or match up really well into other meta decks. These would be cards that aren't useful in every situation, you don't want them all the time, but are always nice to have around. I can see team building in Splatoon going a similar route. In fact, we already see this. There is of course Inkbrush, which prefers Ink Mine in most situations over Splat Bomb. Another obvious one would be picking Point Sensor if you'll know you're going to face a Carbon Roller or a Splat Roller. We also see this on maps like Flounder Heights, where people are more inclined to pick Torpedo or Beacon weapons. There's also Rainmaker, where Rapid Blaster Pro sees play thanks to its Toxic Mist. Actually, it's more so Ink Vac, but Toxic Mist is still part of the equation. My point here being, as Splatoon gets more optimized, I can genuinely see a world where players would find themselves wanting to throw away 1 or 2 lethal bombs to make room for more niche and specialized sub-weapons. Or they would if they had that option. I'm sorry, we don't get a happy ending here, because subs don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a kit, and are attached to a main weapon and a special weapon. If you want to run Toxic Mist on Rainmaker, you have these options, and only really 2 of them are specialized to Rainmaker. A couple more have strong overall power but aren't specialized towards a specific purpose. Same thing applies if you want to run Beacon on Flounder Heights. Of all of these options, you only have 2 that you could argue are specialized. But what are the odds that your team has someone willing to play Dreadringer D or Octorush Nouveau? You can't just ask your Splattershot player to quickly switch their sub to Beacon for this one map. They'd have to change their entire weapon kit, which requires a completely different skill set. So of course they're not going to pick the option that's specialized, they're going to go for the most generally good option instead. Which is unfortunate, because a very common argument I hear against the idea of custom kits is that in practice, everyone will just run the strongest subs. That everyone will just spam Splat Bomb, Burst Bomb and Fizzy Bomb, and you know what, that might be true. That there's an issue of sub-weapon balance that means that, yeah, you're going to see a lot of the strongest options. I think that people very often underestimate the power of synergy and specialization. I don't blame them though, because the kit system, as it stands right now, is one that hinders creativity. A system that incentivizes picking the strongest and more generalist options, because the more specialized options are rarely allowed to be in an environment where they can flourish. So while I do believe that Splatoon does have a problem with sub-weapon balance, I think the problem they need to solve first is the kits those sub-weapons are on.